Hi, this is Jessica Stevens from the African Mini-Grid Developers Association. Thanks, Aaron, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The panel that we're hosting right now is on technological innovation for the decentralized energy space. I think we're going to pretty much jump right into the panel, but just to provide a little bit of framing for everyone, this panel is really talking about the host of different technological solutions that are available to mini-grids and other decentralized utilities across the African continent, and how best to utilize that technology in order to see scale across the sector. We have a super interesting panel with us today. I'm going to just briefly introduce everyone, and then we'll get into the meat of technology and mini grids. So our first panelist is Nico Peterschmidt. Nico is the managing director of Enensis with over 30 staff and is the largest mini-grid focused consultancy in the sector. In the last 15 years, Enensis has drafted mini-grid regulations and policy frameworks and structured grant funds for mini-grids in various markets. Enensis has been supporting governments and companies and investors across the mini-grid market. And in 2020, Enensis made the mini-grid management software, Micropower Management, which is an open source software, which is what Nico's here to talk about today. Nico's also the director of Jumeme Rural Power Supply, and so he has a blended approach that looks at both the consulting aspect and the governmental and policy aspect of mini-grids in conjunction with the operational difficulties of running a mini-grid company. And then in addition to Nico, we have Emily Motor from Stemaco. Emily spent the last 8 years in the African energy sector as the CEO of Stemaco and is a founding board member of the African Mini-Grid Developers Association. She has managed development and the deployment of Stemaco and their smart metering platform, which lets utilities sell electricity in challenging remote environments. And today, Stemaco's smart meters help automate mini-grid operations across 10 countries in Africa and Asia. We also have Ben Atia, who's a senior research analyst from the energy transition practice at Wood Mackenzie. He leads the firm's coverage of energy access and off-grid power in emerging markets and downstream solar PV in Africa and the Middle East. He also conducts research in the Energy for Growth Hub and the Energy Access Project at Duke University. And he's been working with many of us for a long time in this market. We have Elizabeth with us, who's the COO of Modularity Grid, Modularity Grid is combining modularity with the bleeding energy digital technologies to address the critical bottlenecks that limit complex small-scale electricity systems. And then finally, we have Thomas. Thomas is originally from Mobisol, which was a solar home system company, and is currently running ADI, which is focused on helping to track R&D research and data related to the hard nuts of the energy access sector and commercial companies that don't have the money to solve all of the problems in the sector alone. Amongst other topics, A2EI has recently launched a solar generator and standalone solar business system that can power productive use appliances. So that is our industrious panel today. I'm going to quickly hand it over to Nico Peterschmidt to talk more about their open source software, Micropower.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for the introduction. You already said it, like my company is a consultancy company, and we've got more than 15 years experience in the sector. We developed a software which is called Micropower Manager. You can find more information about that software under micropowermanager.com. It is an open source software. We developed it over the last 10 years and deployed it first in our subsidiary in Senegal, in ERSA, and then later in our subsidiary in Tanzania, Jumeme. And currently it is being used with Jumeme with approximately 10,000 customers. So it has basically proven that it works at that scale. We now have also found some 5-6 other companies, mini-grid companies throughout Africa, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Cameroon, from Uganda, that are picking up the software and using it for their own operations. It is a software that optimizes mini-grid basically help you manage mini-grid operations. It's basically connected to your mobile money streams. It's connected to your assets monitoring. It's connected to your customers through SMS. It has got a bidirectional SMS communication integrated. It has got a ticketing system, so you basically can manage not only your customer requests and your call center with it, but also your staff, operational staff, and management staff also. And that basically, including the reporting and all some other additional features, is the scope that enables you to digitize your mini-grid business. And what we say is, once you have achieved that, you can put your mini-grid on autopilot. And that helps you reduce the focus, reduce the effort that you need to put into operating your mini-grid, and you can focus on something else, which can actually open up significant revenues to your mini-grid. And we call that rural industrialization approaches. We also developed calculation methodology of how to compare whether it makes sense to use the mini-grids to run a business addressing local resources and labor forces in the community, to export products from the community into urban and international markets. That calculation methodology we call Keymaker model. I leave it at that, Jessica. Back to you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thanks, Nico. Emily, can I just have you very briefly introduce STEMACO smart meters and the applications that you have developed?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Jess. So I joined STEMACO in 2013, and we actually started out as a mini-grid developer and built our smart metering platform for our own use, and then pivoted and now sell that technology to other mini-grid operators. And in my experience, I think the most important things that technology can do for mini-grids is build customer trust and enable good decision-making. So kind of getting into the specifics a little bit, I think for building customer trust, one of the most important things you can have is reliable remote control. And one of the most important kind of metrics that we track at STEMACO is what we call the pay to power time. So once the customer pays, how quickly does their power turn on? And that's kind of the number one thing we hear about from developers that makes their customers either very happy or very unhappy. And so, you know, they don't care if the communications are unreliable on site, everything just needs to work. Visibility is another big one. So building in notifications to remind customers when to top up, let them check their balance, let them really understand what's going on with their account and feel like they have agency in their own kind of electricity billing, which is something that I think a lot of African consumers don't feel like they have. And then increasingly, as we work on bigger systems and more urban mini grids, loss protection. So, you know, how do you avoid theft and identify when losses are happening? Trust works both ways. So customers need to know that when they pay, they're going to get power, and when they don't pay, they won't get power. So they don't, you know, try to game the system. So I think those, you know, building consumer trust in that way. And then enabling good decision making. I think many new markets, mini grids included, are very unkind learning environments. So you're often not getting very good feedback about what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. And that makes it really hard to, you know, iterate and improve your business. So I think the data that technology like smart meters can provide hopefully helps to answer questions like, you know, what tariff should I use? How many connections should I install at this site? Is it a good time to build out new connections? So broadly, that's what I see as the role of technology, and then more specifically, the smart meters that STEMACO provides.
Thanks for that, Emily. Ben, would you mind just giving us a couple minutes on how through your work and research and writing, you see the formation of technology and how in the mini-grid space?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Just very briefly on WoodMac. So we're a global research and energy consultancy. We kind of have full end-to-end coverage of the entire energy value chain. I sit on sort of one pretty extreme end of that situation. And my role is to look at kind of a stacked view of the African power space, among a few other things. So we try to put sort of a good market context around each of the sort of off-grid segments that we study. So we're looking at solar home systems, mini grids, C&I, diesel displacement for large industrials, the grid context, and utility scale renewables. And we really think that that kind of gives us a good understanding of the true risk profile, the true financing landscape, there's sort of the true impacts of policy. And that really helps us kind of understand the role of technology and how that might play out in the market. So we have both a research group, which is where I sit, and then also a consulting practice, most of which in the energy access space has been to help some large strategics understand and enter the energy access space, and then also to help some of the larger players in the sector look to enter new markets and understand how to operate their business. So yeah, excited to chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Elizabeth, would you mind just sharing a little bit about modularity grid and the kind of work that you guys are doing?
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. So my name is Elizabeth Nyeko, and I'm the CEO and founder of Modularity Grid. My background is very much from the mini grid sector, so a combination between mini grids and academia. So I know kind of firsthand the types of challenges that mini grid operators face in the context of rural off-grid electrification. What tends to happen is that mini grid companies end up facing significantly higher O&M costs, in the context where there's sort of a shortage of skilled labor, typically in rural areas. They target setting up their mini grids in places that are typically quite far and typically quite far away from the grid connection, so quite difficult to reach in terms of infrastructure not being there as well. And worst of all, they kind of hugely rely on manual processes. So that's kind of a key sort of place where we focus on adding value, and the value that we add is firstly around bringing down the costs associated with the inspection, identifying problems, predicting problems in key components. Think of Modularity Grid as that sort of software platform that sits between the technical team that operate a mini grid and the hardware components. So your batteries, your inverters, etc., and really offering that capability to identify problems as early as possible, and ideally doing so before a failure actually takes place.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, thanks. But I was just going to a couple of quick lines. I mean, just the overall impact of that, what we found in pilots that we're conducting is that we can bring down O&M costs by between 30 to 40% and have a huge impact on the overall operational lifetimes of components such as batteries.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. That's super, super interesting. I'm sure that everyone's going to want to hear more about how you can bring down their pricing structures. Thomas, last but not least, would you mind just giving us a couple of minutes on the transition that you made from the solar home system space to A2EI and the super interesting work that you're working on with A2EI?
Sure. So we founded a non-for-profit collaborative R&D institute because we are absolutely convinced that if you wait for commercial companies to solve SDG 7 on their own, it's never going to happen because it's extremely difficult to make money in this sector. Yet there's a lot of hard nuts to be cracked at the R&D level, hardware level, whatever. So we concentrate on doing that. And to give you one example, we have developed a machine that's sitting between solar home systems and mini grids. So think of a 800 watt large solar business system, quite explicitly not home system, that runs productive use appliances. A commercial company doesn't get the equity money from their investors to develop that because we don't know exactly how the business model is going to be. That machine is now out there. So we kind of take the foundation money that is going to A2EI to develop things on behalf of the sector. Not necessarily in the mini grid space, where we come from the standalone part. We've done a very interesting study, I thought, last year on productive use. We've all been waiting for productive use to scale in the last 10 years. It hasn't happened. And we looked at what are the barriers to entry, what are the barriers to adoption of productive use appliance, and we've put forward a methodology which allows you to find out why even putting an efficient machine and kilowatt hours at the disposition of users will not create a business model. And we've been doing actually quite a bit of work with mini grid companies, explicitly power gen, on understanding how clean cooking, as in electric pressure cookers, could actually help find a revenue stream and a high load and so on. So we've put basically hundreds of EPCs in real mini grid environments and did analysis. All of that you can find on the very pink website of a2ei.org. And think of us as a resource. We're basically there to do those things commercial companies will not be in a position to do. And probably one of the only places in the industry where we can work collaboratively. Everybody doing it in his or her corner is not going to work out. So if there's anything you think we can solve, come and knock on our door. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Thomas. And thanks everybody for the introduction to the different aspects of technology that you're working on. I think the first question I have is really to both Nico and Elizabeth. It seems like both of the platforms that you've developed are focused on cost reduction. And I'd like to just get a sense from maybe Nico first and then Elizabeth, how much you are seeing cost reduction in the products that you've developed, and how that's benefiting mini grids and the operations on the ground.
Yeah, well, what we're seeing right now is that especially smaller mini grid companies in Africa are still doing many of the operational tasks, performing many of the operational tasks manually. They have a lot of staff on the ground. They collect the payments manually and cash. Then they upload the tokens or they sell tokens. They print. Then they often basically call a central person in the head office to coordinate tasks around maintenance. And we believe that this should all be more fluent and more straightforward and, let's say, better organized. And well, the platform that we are providing, open source, free of charge, basically, is especially made for those companies which have not taken the step towards more professional management of their mini grids yet. And we are addressing especially these companies, these domestic companies, those companies that have been founded by Africans that now are preparing to grow with our technology, and they can actually pick it up and deploy it free of charge. And at the moment, we even have a small grant from Dune Foundation to support these companies to come into business. And as I said before, put their mini grids on autopilot to focus on those areas where they can really make money. For example, exporting goods from the community.
Thanks so much for that, Nico. Elizabeth, do you want to talk about how you're seeing that integration between technology and operations a little bit more? I know you talked a little bit about in your intro.
Yeah, I gave a little bit of intro, but I think the fundamental thing that we see as far as kind of a lot of mini grid operators is that, as Nico was saying, is this sort of heavy reliance on manual processes. But this extends far beyond just the typical mini grid operators. Even if you go kind of on a global scale and look at large scale sort of multi kind of gigawatt scale installations of solar, there's still a huge amount amount of manual activities that take place, especially if we're talking about O&M activities, things like inspection, and those types of activities that require on-site expertise for people to kind of actually be there, check how things are operating or not operating, diagnose problems, and then read over what they've collected and then use that to figure out what to do next, whether it's making a call out to have someone come in and fix something. So all of these, just if we're talking kind of just global averages, we're still talking around 20% of the levelized cost of electricity going towards O&M. So in the context of a mini grid in a rural village, in somewhere in Tanzania or Kenya, or what have you, what you end up seeing is that these costs are magnified even more because of the distance, because of the difficulty of actually parachuting in or flying in, whoever's actually going to do the diagnostics. So that's sort of the scenario where we really see ourselves adding value from that sort of point of view of being able to monitor these really complex and critical components that can take up nearly kind of 25%, 30% of your capex. And monitoring them and diagnosing problems as early as possible before a failure actually occurs can be tremendously valuable in terms of really kind of bringing down the operational costs.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. Ben, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in the overall research that WoodMac is working on, how you guys are seeing the price point between diesel and mini grids, and how that is affecting rural economies.
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, there's a lot of regional and local nuance there, but at a high level, we're still seeing that without subsidy for the mini grid space, cost competition against diesel still it's compelling, but it's not compelling enough to really unlock a huge amount of investment, especially in markets where the subsidy is instead on the diesel and rather than on the mini grid. So thinking just about some of those comparative economics, it can be a little bit difficult to see what it would look like to have a sort of a massive scale displacement. There's particular uses, particularly in the productive use categories, where diesel costs are just ludicrously high, and solar and batteries can be quite compelling. And we can see savings around 30 to 50% in some cases on levelized cost, with some assumptions around future fuel costs as well. And then again, on the maintenance side, like Elizabeth was just mentioning. But I think one of the things that really drives us back to is the question around subsidy, because we see that subsidy regimes in many markets, Nigeria is the most obvious, have kept those diesel prices artificially low, and then in tandem, there's some subsidy on the mini grid side in Nigeria as well. But those sort of comparative economics are really driven by the conversation and subsidy at the end of the day. On a pure, fully unsubsidized basis, in most cases, the savings are still compelling, but because of some of the operational challenges and some of the customer sensitization, there's a lot more friction there than we originally thought, or than, of course, we'd like to see, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, Ben. Thomas, I know that you have some thoughts on subsidy and the commercial viability of the decentralized energy space. Could I just pull you in here to respond to what Ben was saying on the subsidy side, and particularly in the Nigeria market?
Yeah, I think one of the observations is when you look at infrastructure in the parts of the world where I live, for example, in Germany, most of the infrastructure I'm using on a daily basis has been financed by public money. And I think that's the rule in many of the countries, which have infrastructure. And strangely so, when we look at SDG 7, and I think I'm going back in time now, 2015, there was kind of this assumption, well, our customers are going to pay for the CapEx, they're going to pay for the OpEx, and they're going to pay for a return for the investors, and we're still going to reach SDG 7, it's going to be easy until 2030. Well, that doesn't work. And I think, what's the expectation? We're building infrastructure, whether it's mini grid, standalone systems, or whatnot. And this kind of strange assumption that it's going to work commercially and going to make everybody happy. I think we're now at a point where we know it's not happening. And then the question is, where do you put the limited amount of subsidy or, grants, whatever money, concessional finance that you have? And I think I would be very much in favor of diversifying where this money goes. There's been a lot of money flowing to mini grids because it was clearly, apparent from the very beginning that it needed, this kind of capex support. But I think as the standalone systems mature and show that you can actually run productive use appliances with standalone systems, I think, it needs to have a level playing field. And there's one very important thought that I wanted to share. Back in 2018, we looked at, together with Rafiki Power, which was still around then, how solar home system companies and mini grid companies could ally around providing energy, say, for a village. So rather than forcing the mini grid company to put connections to every single household, find those households that will never require productive use appliance, that will never require lots of power, equip these with solar home systems, and then the subsidy need on a per household connection goes down by 30 to 40%. And I think at the time we called it the hybrid grid. And I think that would be a concept that's, I think, worth putting forward to those people who have the subsidy money to see whether that would be an attractive proposition to get more connection done with a limited amount of subsidies.
Thanks, Thomas. Emily, I'm going to pivot to you. I think we've sort of left you behind in this conversation. I know you have personal opinions about subsidization in the market, but maybe if there's a way to integrate the subsidy conversation into some of the modalities that are in the steam comb smart meter and how you see those being interrelated.
That's quite a challenge.
You can, yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Well, so I mean, I think what I can offer is some thoughts about like what I'm hearing everyone talking about, and I think what's probably on everyone's mind is the economics of mini grids are really challenging, and that's something that it's a lesson we've learned over and over and over again. Certainly, I'm sick of learning that lesson. Probably everyone else is too. And I think maybe a question in everyone's mind is, can technology really make the difference here? Or is this just a matter of getting the policy right, or, getting enough momentum behind the funding, or, like what's technology's role in solving that problem? And that's really why I brought up decision-making in the beginning. I think if there were a silver bullet, if there were easy ways to make this work, I think we would have found it. And so we can assume that there's going to be difficult decisions to make. Like, for example, the age-old question of what kind of a tariff is acceptable, because the higher you set your tariffs, the more revenue you can bring into the space and the faster you can build out infrastructure. But on the flip side, that can be unfair to rural consumers. And these are really challenging questions that don't have an easy answer. And so as in my biased opinion, what you have to do is invest in the data to help you make good decisions. So if you don't have information about what's working and what isn't, you're going to make the wrong decision, and it's going to hold the sector back from growing as quickly as it could. And I think the good news is that mini grid companies generally have invested in good information technology, and there's a lot of innovation in the sector. For example, modularity grid. I didn't know about you guys, but 30 to 40% reduction in O&M. That's amazing. That's every mini grid developer's dream. So I think, if you look at, for example, on grid, on the national grids versus on mini grids, what percentage of connections have, first of all, any kind of meter, and then specifically smart meters that are giving you high resolution data on a reliable basis that you can actually use to track things over time. That's really, it's a much higher percentage on mini grids, because I think these companies have invested in kind of good data generation and good information technology. So that's my attempt at trying to tie all of this together. Hopefully that was somewhat successful. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Emily. I think you did a great job. Better than I did in link it all together. Before we open it up to audience questions, there's a few that are starting to come in, but before we do that, Nico, maybe if I could just get you to talk a little bit more about the keymaker model, how you see that as integrated with both the productive use of energy and cost reduction that Elizabeth and Emily have talked about, and where you see that as part of the ecosystem for mini grids.
Yeah, some of my co-panelists have already indicated how difficult it is to make mini grids or the off-grid business in general a profitable business for investors. And we did the same, like as you said in your introductory statement, well, we are a consultancy company, but we also have mini grid companies in Senegal and Tanzania. At least we're shareholders there, and that is where we run experiments. And these experiments sometimes fail, sometimes they succeed, and whatever succeeds, we then sell through the consultancy arm, or we package into the software products, or we basically shout it out to the general public and say, hey guys, now this is the way which we believe is a successful path. And the keymaker model is actually one of those paths that we identified to be potentially a successful, commercially successful avenue for mini grid companies. So it's basically the idea of utilizing the infrastructure that you brought out to this rural area together, and this is even the more important part, with the personnel and the expertise and the capacity that you bring out to rural areas. When you electrified a village in a very, very remote place in Africa or even in Asia, you don't just bring the infrastructure there, the generation, the distribution, and you run the system, but you have sorted out so many things that nobody has ever sorted out before, right? You sorted out the logistics to the site. You basically set up a company there in like a structure there that has all the capacities to do proper business in these rural areas. Basically, you have got management staff out there. Usually university graduates go there every now and then. They're usually one of the highest, like most highly educated people in the community. Then you have sorted out your accounting, your controlling, and everything is connected to that site. So at the end, you can ask yourself, you can wonder, well, why am I just selling a few kilowatt hours here and there to individual households or some shops, right? Or even to businesses. You will probably ask yourself, like, can't I do more with that? Like, you have got all this capacity there. Can't I just generate a business that does more than just selling a few kilowatt hours? And that is where, like, what we also wondered when we put up our mini grids on islands in Lake Victoria and Tanzania, and we started basically purchasing fish from the fishermen, because almost everybody in the community is somehow related to the fish chain. But they couldn't really catch the fish anymore that was demanded by the market. So therefore, we started purchasing from the fishermen fish that they usually don't fish, but which is there in abundance. And then we started trading that fish to a central off-taker in the capital of Tanzania, which is Dar es Salaam. And that at the end turned out to be a more interesting business than the actual electricity sales from the mini grids. And the idea was to elaborate on that and to expand this idea, and we created some general understanding around how the economics around this concept that we developed and tested once work. And we developed the concept of the keymaker model, whereas the mini grid is the key, the mini grid operator is the key maker, and the key maker using the key can unlock a market that was formerly disconnected. Basically a market that has got the demand, which is the urban market or the international market, and the supply from the rural area. And that is possible if you bring together the information technology, the capacity, and the infrastructure, and you have everything on site. And that is what we believe will be one of the opportunities that mini grid operators have in the future. Once they have, as I said before, put their mini grids on autopilot, basically fully digitalizing their operations and making the operations, the actual operations of electricity generation, distribution, and supply very simple.
Thanks so much for that, Nico. That's super, super interesting. There's a bunch of questions that are starting to come in from the audience, and some internal questions. And I think, Elizabeth, it would be great to hear from you about how successful you have been in bringing down the O&M cost to 30 to 40%, where you guys are seeing those cost reductions on the O&M side, and where you think that could go in the future.
Yeah, so we're seeing, sort of significant opportunities. So, well, to reduce O&M, I think maybe the best way to split it is to say, okay, look at your battery inverter, for example. If you look at the pure capex costs of that in a mini grid, on average, we'd be looking at around 25 to 30% going towards that kind of aspect. And so if your battery, if your solar panels can last potentially 20 or 30 years, and then your batteries die 5 years in, or a year in, or 2 years in, then you end up in a scenario where you're having much higher overall capex costs because you haven't been taking care of your battery, haven't been sort of properly collecting the data that you need to be able to make decisions that are needed to protect it, to maintain its life, to extend its life. That's kind of one aspect that where we see a significant potential for savings. And then if you look at also the fact that the level of expertise that is typically involved in order to be able to handle the diagnostics, in order to be able to handle the battery maintenance, in order to handle the diagnostic aspect of that can be incredibly challenging to get hold of in rural areas at a cost-effective level. So that is kind of one really important area where we see potential to bring down to bring in savings. The other side is also in terms of just kind of other activities. Essentially, we cover. I suppose like a good example is to think of modularity grid as that software that sits between the hardware components and the mini grid operator. So really with the end goal of making that aspect of the activities as easy, as simple as possible, as easy to manage as possible, so that they can really kind of focus on bringing down their cost margins. Because the story with mini grids often is, people going, hey, actually, we need to increase the cost that we're charging people. We need subsidies, but you don't hear enough about people talking about cost controls and the importance of actually trying to make the economics work from that perspective. And we're saying, we're not saying that there's a kind of one single magical bullet for everything. But if, let's say, you're using a SteamEco solution on the one hand, so you know exactly what people are consuming. On the other hand, you're using a modularity grid platform to make sure that your batteries don't go down, earlier than they should, and that you can then you can start to move the needle around managing your costs and making your mini grid more sort of cost effective to operate.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. There's a couple questions from the audience for Thomas. Thomas, would you be able to expand on what you see as the space between the solar home systems and mini grids and the technological solutions?
Sure. So it basically goes back to the Mobisol days where, solar home system stops at 200, 300 watts, somewhere there. And I think all of our customers, or most of our customers, said, look, thank you for bringing a solar home system in my home. Now I need a system that's going to run my business. Bring me a large solar business system. And at the time, for many reasons, we didn't have the money to develop that segment. You can wait for the mini grid to come to your location to run productive use appliances, and what's basically securing your income, but because mini grids are slower to develop than we hoped, we need an alternative. And there's this glaring gap for me for all these people who are using fuel generators. I'm not talking the big diesel generators. Think of a country like Nigeria. There's literally millions of small fuel generators. They're called Better Pass My Neighbor in Nigeria that are running, a couple of hours a day as a backup for the grid. And these things are running lights, fans, TV, productive user plants. And there's no reason, no tech reason why a larger standalone solar system shouldn't be in a position to run these things. So we went to Nigeria and we put lots of smart meters on existing fuel generators because we said, rather than asking users how many liters of fuel do you put in, just put a smart meter and a fuel meter on a fuel generator, look at it for a couple of months, and then you're going to have a very good idea of what the load curve is. We did that on a couple of hundred of generators, and suddenly we had a synthetic load curve for all these generators running in Nigeria. We gave that to our engineers and said, build a solar solution that will allow us to replace 90% at the technical level of these fuel generators. So a real carbon impact, take the generator output, a solar generator, which is just a marketing name for a large solar business system. And that's what I mean by the gap that needs to be addressed, because we cannot put a mini grid in every location where productive user plants and more load is basically needed. So our system, have a look on the website, it's roughly 800 watt solar panel array. It has inverters of 1,000, 3,000 watt, and it has the according battery sizes that are needed at a price point way below $1,000. And that's one of the specific contributions of the A2EI, because we're not charging for the development costs. We've basically, internalized the R&D cost for putting that kind of white label product at the disposition of the sector, where it fits in the portfolios of the different companies.
Thanks so much for that, Thomas. I'm going to keep this open to the whole panel, but what percentage of I'm good on question. What percentage, or how much of the mini grid technology is new versus borrowed from the larger utility sector, from other spaces? And, is that a positive thing for the mini grid space or a negative thing for the mini grid space? And I think on the flip side of that, how much of the technology that's being developed for mini grids, particularly on O&M reduction and customer management, is something that is being or should be adopted by larger scale utilities? Maybe, Emily, I'll just pass it to you because it sort of sits in the crux of some of the work that you do.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Certainly, STEAMACO was founded on the basis that a lot of the technology that existed for main grids, and I would say particularly for developed world main grids, was not fit for purpose for mini grids. And that was, I think, true particularly in the early days because the mini grids were so rural. And so if you took a smart meter that was designed for the UK market and stuck it on a mini grid in rural Africa, it would do you absolutely zero good, and it would be 100% a waste of money. And not to mention that it would cost way too much to really be a workable option for mini grids. And so I think there's a lot to be said for solutions that are built for the specific markets that they serve. I think there's a lot of differences in the mini grid market that do require solutions that are designed by people who really understand what it means to operate a mini grid. And I think, everybody on this panel who's built technology solutions, I think it's notable that all those people come from a place of having actually tried to operate mini grids themselves. And so really being able to kind of put themselves in the shoes of the operators and know where the pain points are. And I think that because it's a new market and because it's had a lot of, I guess, more patient or risky capital than the utility sector. I think that there are some innovations that come out of that are absolutely relevant to the grid market. So, I mean, Nico is talking about, how clunky most payment systems are. In Nigeria, for example, a lot of payments aren't done over mobile money. They're very manual. A lot of the connections in Nigeria are not even metered. You have estimated billing. And so people are paying an amount of money that has nothing to do with how much electricity they consume. So, I mean, there are a lot of improvements that I think if you took from the mini grid sector, some of the innovation that's been able to happen and put it onto the grid, that absolutely that would be beneficial. Hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's great. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has thoughts on the intersection there.
I have a few things I'd like to say about that, if that's all right.
Go for it,
I think
Ben.
on the generation side and the sort of infrastructure piece of the mini grid space, most of that is borrowed. And I think that that's a really good thing because those costs have come down really dramatically over the last decade. And that's, in some senses, the mini grid sector can ride on the coattails of the grid connected solar space and Chinese manufacturing and some of these other benefits that would otherwise make the mini grid sector even more untenable, right? However, I think Steamico, some of your competitors, modularity grid, some of the things that you guys are doing to make specific technology fit for purpose for low cost pay-go connections, I think that's really new and that's really valuable. And I completely agree that that has a massive role to play in the digitization of state-owned utilities in the region, right? So like I mentioned, we kind of try to take as much of a stacked view as possible of sort of the power space on-grid and off-grid. And one of the things that we're increasingly realizing is state utilities are either going to cooperate or compete with the mini grid sector. And both of those things could be good or both of them could be bad. But it really depends on making sure that the sector and the state utility in each market is on the same page about what the role is. Are we competing for quality of service? Are we competing for new customers? Are we cooperating and dividing up the market in a way that's helpful? And are there ways that state utilities can provide transparency to mini grid companies? And likewise, is there technology that mini grid companies can then provide to state utilities? And there are some smart metering companies in this space that are doing some really excellent product development and really excellent market development in terms of helping state utilities digitize their operations and improve their fiscal and operational performance. And I think that that's really, really important. And it kind of tends towards the cooperation rather than competition side, at least in that one particular area. But I think there's, we did a sort of an esoteric exercise within WoodMac to think about how do we track and measure and quantify activity in the mini grid sector, and then how do we compare that to what we might call a microgrid in advanced electricity markets, and what are some of those differences? And we went back and forth, and it was very hard to say, are these the same thing just in a different context? Are there differences here that are distinctive? Because the markets are very clearly different, and the economics are very clearly different, and the value proposition is very clearly different. But the technology is essentially the same, with the exception of sort of that pay-go smart metering layer in a way that looks a little bit different in the mini grid sector. So I think there's a lot of value in maybe separating a few of those pieces and just being really clear on technological advantages that the mini grid sector has gained from other sectors, and that's a good thing, and we can celebrate that, and that's great. And then where has the mini grid sector differentiated its technology, and then is there broader applicability of that to state utilities or maybe even to advanced electricity market microgrids in some cases? And what sort of learnings or sharing or collaboration could there be there? But yeah, I think maybe splitting those two out and recognizing those wins and taking them where they are, I think is something that's valuable when thinking about the technology conversation and also bringing costs down, because there is sort of this other piece of it too, which is how much of the technology cost, based on where we are with the CapEx stack for mini grids today, how much of that has come from benefits from other sectors or other sort of adjacent pieces of the energy space, and how much more can new technological innovation drive down the cost of mini grids more than it already will by riding that cost curve for solar and batteries and inverters and all of those things? Or is the real linchpin for bringing mini grid costs down in the markets, in the policy, in the financial structures, and those sorts of things? So maybe I'll pose that question back to the panel as well.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. Nico, I've seen your head bobbing up and down while Ben was talking. Do you want to?
Yeah, Ben mentioned it already. Ben mentioned it already. There is some integration going on between the large utility sector and the mini grid space, and that is happening on various levels. Like just look into Senegal, where currently some 300 or even more mini grids are being established, EPC, and then handed over to the concessionaires, which are large utilities. Look into Ethiopia, where large parts of the 250 million dollars that the World Bank is providing to the government will most probably flow through the national utility, and they will set up mini grids. They will, of course, also cooperate with private sector mini grid operators and service providers. But there is integration going on. Or look into Nigeria, where the interconnected mini grid, basically, like our company introduced that concept to the Nigerian market in 2016, and it's now picking up. And that integrates basically large utilities, the discos, with the mini grid operators. And this is, I think, a bridge which probably will help the technology that has specifically been developed for mini grids enter into the large utility space, and where also knowledge and understandings from the large utility space will probably migrate step by step also into the mini grid sector.
Jess, you're muted.
Shoot. Thanks for that, Emily. Thanks for that, Nico. It's a super interesting space to think about that intersection. And I think I'm just going to just toss it quickly back to you again, Nico, because I know you've been working on the grid integration problem in Nigeria. And are you guys seeing traction in grid integration and that collaboration between utilities and mini grids moving forward? And do you think that that's replicable in other markets?
I think the interconnected mini grid piece in Nigeria is one of the most interesting parts of the market there. As I said, it has taken long, and since inception of the concept in 2016 and publishing this concept for the first time, it really took 5 years, right? 4 to 5 years until somebody actually picked it up. Everybody's been talking about this concept for 5 years, and everybody's been saying, "Oh, there's great potential there, and this is even the better investment opportunity to compare to isolated mini grids." But the discos have been very hesitant, and now as the discos are opening up, and this is also thanks to the good work of the Nigerian Energy Support Program and the government, the ministry, REA, and so on. Now it's actually, I'm seeing significant traction there, and there's a larger number of interconnected mini grids being developed. And this is also where, as you can actually have significant demand in these semi or suburban areas, electricity demand, the profitability looks completely different, and that is where money is flowing, right? And I'm seeing that other jurisdictions and governments are looking into this with very high interest. And I'm seeing every now and then government representatives picking up this terminology of interconnected mini grids, but in many cases, they have not fully understood what it means. In many cases, they still mix it up with this SPP, SPD, like small power producer, small power distributor kind of setup. And not as an integration, as a bridge, as I said before, to make large utilities work together with small mini grid operators. But yeah, there is something going on.
Thanks so much for that,
Can I add
Nico.
something really briefly to that? I want to I completely agree with what Nico's saying. And I think just one follow-on point there. There's a question around for mini grid players on the technology side. You can either own the sort of generation space. There's a distribution angle, and then there's also sort of a ancillary services or adjacent services angle. I call it value stacking. I think Nico pretty closely falls into his rural industrialization definition as well. But there's also a technology component there too. And there's also a question of the future role of mini grid players when you talk about interconnected systems as well. So the perennial question that everyone's been asking in the mini grid space since the very beginning is what happens when the grid arrives? And what does that mean for our role, right? Do we still own our customers? Do we still own the generation? Are we now competing with generation that's supplied from the main grid? How does this work? But there's another piece that the state utilities can't really do, at least not right now, which is how do you increase and stimulate demand? How do you offer, productive use? How do we sort of, add all of these adjacent revenues and revenue streams beyond kilowatt hours? And I think that is something that mini-grid players, whether there is cooperation or competition, mini-grid players are becoming increasingly specialized at doing. And I think that when you're talking about the interconnection of systems, and as Nico said, it's sort of this tired question in a lot of ways. There's sort of that piece of it which doesn't get brought up quite enough, in my opinion. So I'd be curious to hear if anyone has any thoughts on that as well.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thomas, can I throw Ben's question to you? Do you have thoughts on the adjacent revenue streams and sort of how that sits both within the utility space and the mini grid space and the solar home system space?
Well, I think when we did this analysis with Rafiki Power at the time, I remember the number was 50% of the customers of a mini grid will probably never require more than lights and very basic electricity services. So I think if we persist in trying to elevate every customer, in the next tier, it's not going to work. Let's face it. Many of the customers, independently of whether it's mini grid or solar home systems, just don't have the money for additional services. So the revenue you're thinking of in terms of mini grid perspective will probably only come from a selected group of households or businesses that will generate incremental income with whatever productive use machine. And I think, it's worth zooming in on those maybe 10, 20%, whatever the percentage may be, and then really look at which productive use supplies actually work within a mini grid at the business model level. And I'd really invite you to look at the methodology which we developed, and we put, Excel sheets, you can do the calculations yourself, because it's just assuming that putting lots of productive use appliances that need lots of kilowatt hours is going to solve the problem of the customer and of the mini grid provider is probably not true. So it's really kind of, coming back to this hybrid grid idea. Those customers who need probably tier one, probably better off with a small Pico system. And there's no way in the world that the CapEx plus the OpEx of the mini grid will be kind of recouped by any kind of income from customers. And I think, it's probably very undiplomatic what I'm saying. But I think freeing mini grid providers from the obligation to connect every single person in the constituency or in the village or whatever would be a first step towards really concentrating on the sub-segment in the mini grid constituency that has a likelihood of making themselves money and the mini grid provider money.
Thanks so much for that, Thomas. Emily, we have a couple minutes left. I don't know if you want to respond to what Thomas is saying about the consumer base for mini grids, or what you guys are seeing from the perspective of SEMACO and both the ability to pay and the growth on the tranches of customers in the mini grid market.
Oh, yeah, that's a big topic. I did want to say I really like the kind of the dichotomy that Ben raised about, is it going to be, is the relationship between mini grid or distributed utilities and centralized utilities, is it going to be collaborative or competitive? And this may be I'm a generally optimistic person, so, grain of salt, but I'm inclined to believe that the collaborative approach is the right one and is the one that I hope will win out, because Thomas mentioned, there really are there are things that I think on-grid utilities do better than mini-grid developers, and vice versa. And the truth of the matter is, right now, that most of the connections that utilities might fight over are likely, at least in the short term, to be loss-making connections. And so it's sort of like, what are you competing over? The ability to lose more money than the other person. And really, this is a problem where both sides have the same goal. This is a highly regulated space. It's a public good that is being provided. And I think everybody who's in the space genuinely wants to see SDG 7 get reached. And right now we're absolutely not on track to do that. And so we're much more in the position of trying to solve a problem, and the more people stick to their strengths and try and work in a collaborative way, I think the more likely we are to come closer to hitting that target. So that was the thought. That it's not really what you asked me, Jess, but that was the thought.
That's okay. It's a great answer. It's a great answer to Thomas's question. We have 1 minute left before we need to hand it back to the next session. But to my panelists, is there anything else that you want to add about technology and about how it's impacting the viability of the mini grid sector before we close out?
Yeah, sure. I'll just make a few last comments. Ultimately, there's not going to be one particular solution that's going to be 100% perfect for 100% of users, 100% of locations. And so this is very much a scenario where there'll be some sort of an energy mix that would work in one context to sort of meet the needs of one particular community, and a very different energy mix whether it's a combination of mini grids and solar home systems or something else that would work elsewhere. So I think that's probably the direction that people should be looking.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. I can see Nico wants to get a last word in.
Yeah, I think this was a very nice panel, really highlighting the main aspects of integration. And we've talked about integration of solar home systems with mini grids and where they can work together. We've talked about integration of main grid utility operators with mini grids. And I think what we all need to work on now is efficiency gains. Right. On the one hand, efficiency gains, how can we actually minimize operational costs? That is what Elizabeth has talked about. I have talked about that briefly. And also Emily has talked about this a little bit. So therefore, I believe we should actually focus from the technology side more on the integration parts. How do we optimize operations? How do we actually cut down operational costs? But also look right and left and make sure that we don't miss any opportunities to actually make money on the way.
Thanks so much for that, Nico. It's a perfect way to close out the panel. So thank you for putting the closing remarks together for me. And with that, we'll close out and hand off to the next session. Thank you so much to the panelists for participating today, and thank you to the audience and the questions for actively participating in the session. Hope everybody has a good afternoon.
I'll wait to see your golden smile, feel of 1,000 kisses. Oh, please stay a while. I'll reach up to hold your sunlit face. Feels like a handful of silk now. I'm in your warm embrace. Oh, I hope this feeling lasts till the oceans turn to glass and the world around us turns and fades to black. Together we'll hold back the sun in this moment, forever young. Against the stream of time we'll run, baby. We'll hold back the sun. This feeling moves me every single day. I'm captured by your charm, enchanted by your ways. In the magic of your eyes, I've become lost in their spell. So come closer, my dear, because all is well. Oh, I hope this feeling lasts till the oceans turn to glass and the world around us turns and fades to black. Together we'll hold back the sun in this moment, forever young. Against the stream of time we'll run, baby. We'll hold back the sun. When the sun goes down and the world spins round, when I lay right next to you, I can't close my eyes even though I try. These perfect moments of you, I fall asleep in embrace in the morning, awake to that perfect side of you. Together we'll hold back the sun in this moment, forever young. Against the stream of time we'll run, baby. We'll hold back the sun in this moment, forever young. Against the stream of time we'll run, baby. We'll hold back the sun in this moment, forever.
Too many days in the darkness without a glimpse of the light. Running tired and broken and scared, but I swear I'll never give up the fight. I see you broken and beat, head pulled down over your eyes. Every part of you wants to surrender, darling, you were meant to survive. With every star, we are born again. Open your heart, spend less time in your head. With every star, we are born again. Open your heart, spend less time in your head. Just like a seed in a garden, you will grow to be tall, staring out over miles of land without it, but wanting to build up walls. Lift me up in your branches, we can can watch the sunrise. Just a couple of bruised up souls that believe that it was worth one more try. With every star, we are born again. Open your heart and spend less time in your head. With every star, we are born again. Open your heart, spend less time in your head.